Hi everyone, welcome back to the Physical Educator. If you're looking for IB Sport Science videos, subscribe to the channel. If you're a teacher looking for resources, visit the TES page and you can pick up units there. Today we're going to talk about biomechanics and we're going to start with the assessment objectives.
Within biomechanics, it's breadth over depth. We cover a wide range of biomechanical principles, but we don't really need to go into that much detail. There's 4 or 5 of the different units where you've got to explain or analyse, but unlike the other topics where you've got to go in great detail, this is just an application to sport really. So there isn't much depth to it, but there is a wide range of biomechanical principles to cover, and your GCSE physics knowledge will come in very, very handy.
So the first 2 specification points are looking at the key terms. Now these key terms are important for us to know within biomechanics because they're going to be used within the whole unit. And the second specification point is looking at graphs. 3 different graphs that we need to explore.
So we're going to start with the key terms within this unit. But in order to do that, we need to know whether these key terms are going to be a scalar or a vector. The difference between the two, scalars have magnitude, vectors have magnitude and direction. An example, mass. The mass of an object is a scalar. It only has magnitude, it only has size, and the mass of an object, let's say, is 75 kilograms. A vector, it has direction too. So a vector would be weight. Weight is mass times the gravity force, and that obviously is pulling downwards, giving it direction. So let's say the 75 kilogram mass works out to be about 700 newtons if it was a vector, as its mass times gravity. That's the difference between scalars and vectors, and we'll explore that further as we go through the quantities. We're going to start by looking at force. So gravity, as I've just mentioned, and weight, they are a force. They're measured in newtons. They're a vector. Other forces could be a push, a pull, it could be the air resistance, it could be drag. There's many forces that will interact with an object and change the motion of that object, and they are a vector. Distance, quite obvious. The length of a space between 2 points, it's measured in meters. It's a scalar. Literally, it's between point A and point B. But there might be a journey to get there. Displacement, a little bit different than distance. Displacement is moving from an object's start place directly to an object's finish. And I'll give you an example of the difference between distance and displacement. And the easiest example to give is on a running track. If we're doing a 100-meter sprint, the distance and the displacement are both 100 meters. It's in a straight line from start to finish. If the athlete is to run 400 meters, the distance is 400 meters. Yet the displacement is 0 because you've finished at your start point. If you were to look at the 200 meters or the 1500 meters, for the distance, it would be 200 or 1500. For the displacement, it would be a straight line from the start position of the 2 or the 1500 straight to the finish line, right across the middle of the track. That would be the displacement. It's the straight line from start to finish. And that is the difference between distance and displacement. Next, we're going to look at speed and velocity. Now, if I was to ask you what's a speed, you'd be able to tell me. If I was to ask you what a velocity is, you could possibly tell me the same thing. But some of you might get stung just because of the word velocity. And I'm going to make it really simple for you here. It's the same thing. The only difference is the velocity has a direction. That's why it's a vector. But the concept of it is just speed. It's just how fast you're moving. But it happens to have a direction alongside it. That's the only difference between speed and velocity. Acceleration is slightly different. Acceleration is the velocity change in a period of time. So your velocity might be 30 meters per second if you're the fastest person that's ever been on the planet. I think Usain Bolt got to about 27 meters per second when he broke the world record. So let's say you're 30 meters per second, you're currently running at the fastest speed ever. But you're not at that speed for the whole race. You get there about 60 or 70 meters when you hit top speed. So you've accelerated up to that speed, and you might have had 10 meters per second after the first 10 or 15 meters. Then it goes up to 20 meters per second. Then you're up to 30 meters per second, and your velocity is changing in a period of time. And this is measured in meters per second and is a vector quantity. So speed and velocity measured in meters per second. The difference being that velocity has a direction, so it might be meters per second north, meters per second west. Acceleration is also a vector because we're talking about velocity, and it's meters per second, also has a direction. Next, we're going to look at momentum and impulse. Now, these two terms are important for us to understand because they come up a number of times within this unit. Momentum, it's a term we've heard before, and we've even heard it in a different context. We've heard it, a team has momentum because they've won several games, so they've picked up momentum and they're moving. And that comes from the actual definition of momentum, where it's about how forceful something can move. And the forceful movement comes from the mass of the object multiplied by the velocity of the object. So if you have two people that both weigh 75 kilograms, and one of them is moving at 20 meters per second, one's moving at 10 meters per second, the one that's moving faster has the better momentum. But you could also argue that it's not about the speed, because there's mass and velocity that make this momentum, make this vector quantity. So an object could be 90 kilograms with a less velocity, but the momentum would be larger because of the combination of the mass and velocity. So I'm thinking rugby here as an easy example, or American football, when you have the big guys running through. They're probably not as fast as, let's say, the wingers or the fullback or the wide receiver. I think that's the term for American football. It's not my sport. But what you've got here is a big, strong mass with a relatively fast velocity, creating a large momentum, more so than a much lighter mass multiplied by a much higher velocity. Again, gives you momentum, and it just depends on that combination, how effective it is for the sport that you're playing. But that's the relationship there between mass and velocity that's making momentum. And again, it's a vector. It's measured in kilograms per meters per second. And it's a vector because we've got velocity in there already, so we know that it's got direction. Impulse is force multiplied by time. It's a vector quantity because the force itself will come with a direction, whether it's a push, pull, whether it's gravity, air resistance, whatever it is, there'll be a direction with that force. But with an impulse, it's the amount of force that is applied for a period of time. So I'm going to talk about this analogy a few times. Think about a follow through in a sport. So I'm going to talk about golf. When you hit a golf ball, you don't stop as you make contact with the ball. You hit right through the ball and follow through up and over your shoulder. And the follow through keeps you in contact with the object for longer. So therefore you're imposing that force for longer, increasing the impulse, therefore increasing the actual output. And there are key terms. What we now need to look at is three different graphs. Our first graph is a distance time graph. So distance is up the y-axis, time is across the x-axis, and distance over time gives us what? Gives us speed or velocity. So we're looking for a speed here. We're not looking for a change in speed, we're looking for an actual speed. So as you can see on these three lines on the graph, if there's a straight line diagonally, it means there's a constant forward speed. If it's perfectly in between the grids, then it would go up in a constant speed, very easy to view. This one's slightly faster than that, because this one's going roughly around 3 meters every 2 seconds, the line that you can see on your screen. But it's a steady speed and it increases at the same speed. The line at the top, when you get to 6 seconds to 11 seconds, there's no movement at all. As you can see, you get to 10 meters in 6 seconds, and then you've not moved until 11 seconds. So there's no movement. There's no speed, there's no velocity, there's no movement. The line on the way back down, it obviously shows a backward speed on this particular graph, and you won't really see a graph like this. This is just to understand them, because it goes back down to 0, so the distance goes backwards. But what's important for us to look at with these lines is the arc, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So just to recap these three lines, if it's a straight line, there is no movement. A straight horizontal line on a distance time graph, no movement. You're not moving. That line could be right at the bottom, so it's a 0 movement, or you could get to a certain distance and stop. There's no more movement. If it's a diagonal line that's straight, it's a constant speed, so it's the same speed. If you get an arced line, it's an acceleration, and if you've got that line in reverse coming back down, it will be a deceleration. And these are the speed differences in a distance time graph. The next graph that we need to look at is a velocity time graph. So this time, instead of looking at velocity, we're looking at the change in velocity. So velocity is up the y-axis, time is along the x-axis, and what we're looking for here is acceleration. The first graph we were looking at speed and velocity. This graph we're looking at acceleration. So the steady line that goes up on the distance time graph gave us a steady speed. This gives us a steady acceleration, meaning you are increasing your speed. So imagine being in a car and putting your foot down steadily. That is what's happening here. You're going faster and faster and faster and faster in a steady manner. Whereas in the distance time graph, this line would have represented pressing cruise control and going at the same speed consistently. When we get to the line that goes horizontal at the top, where there was no movement on the first graph, now there's a constant velocity. So this is the cruise control. You're going at 10 meters per second for 5 seconds. So therefore you've covered 50 meters in 5 seconds. It's as simple as that. It's a constant velocity. Your velocity is not changing. Then on the way down, we're talking about rapid deceleration or rapid acceleration. Again, to recap, constant velocity on the velocity time graph is the horizontal line, whereas on the distance time graph, it represents no movement. The middle graph on the distance time graph represents a steady speed, whereas on the velocity time graph, it represents a steady acceleration. Note the difference between speed and acceleration. Acceleration is the change of speed. Speed is the distance covered in a particular time. The last graph does represent acceleration, but it's a steady acceleration in the distance time graph. This is a rapid acceleration where you're getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, as opposed to increasing the speed gradually. Our final graph is one that is quite popular on the IB exams, is a force time graph. Now again, you probably won't see the force time graph like this example here, but I've got to explain this to you before we can move on to the actual one you'll probably see. I spoke earlier about an impulse, and that's what we're looking at here. It's the force that you apply over a certain amount of time. And the longer you apply that force for, the larger the impulse. That's why we follow through in golf. That's why we follow through in football. It's why there's a follow through in shot put. You should end up facing the other way when you do it in PE lessons. You have a tennis shot where you end up over your opposite shoulder. Most sporting examples where you need to move an object, there is a follow through because you increase the impulse. The last example I'll give is imagine running on sand. It's much more difficult than running on the ground. Why? Because it's difficult for you to generate an impulse to then use Newton's third law to push back up. So you have an upward motion with the same force that you have a downward motion. It's difficult to do that when the sand disperses and moves as you try and put your force into the ground. The graph that we need to know about is footfalls to do with 100-meter sprinting. And we have positive impulses, zero impulse, and a negative impulse. And let's explore this a little bit further. At the start of a 100-meter race, there is a large positive impulse. This is because you need to accelerate at the start of the race. You need to generate your velocity and increase your velocity. You do this by your foot being in contact with the floor for longer periods of time because you need to generate your speed. You need to generate your power. And you can only do that when you're in contact with the floor. So there's a large positive impulse. As you can see from the graph, that means that there's a larger area that's above the zero line than under it. The second of the three graphs that you might see for this is what we call either an equal net impulse or a zero net impulse. And this is where the line above zero is equal to the line underneath. And this is usually when you get to a constant velocity, when you've hit your top speed and you're trying to maintain your top speed, roughly in between 50 and 70 meters of the race. Our final graph represents the finish to a 100-meter sprint. No sprinter sprints over the finish line at their top speed. They try to, but it's physically impossible. So they do slightly slow down. And if you look at velocity splits in a 100-meter race, you'll see this. Top speed's about 70 meters, and from that moment onwards, they start to decelerate. Again, not through want, but that's just what happens. For this graph, there is a small positive impulse, but we can call it a large negative impulse because the big area you can see on the graph is underneath zero, and there's a smaller area for the impulse above zero. And they're the three different types of graph that we need to look at when we look at force time graph.
The next 2 points are looking at centre of mass, what it is and how it can be manipulated during sporting activities.
So, centre of mass is the mathematical point at which mass of an object is distributed, meaning it has balance, it won't fall over, it won't topple. It's the centre of mass. Or it can be the controlled position of mass over a base of support. But what's important for us is to know how we can manipulate centre of mass. As you can see here, I'm standing against a wall. My heel, the back of my knee, and my bum is against the wall. I'm going to try and touch my toes, see what happens. As you can see, I toppled forward. I wasn't able to do so because my centre of mass moved in front of my body. Therefore, I rotate around my centre of mass and I fell forwards. If I was to move away from the wall and do this again, my bum would push outwards and I'd be able to touch my toes. What we need to look at is how this knowledge of centre of mass can be manipulated to better a sports performance, and there's no better example to use here than the high jump. For years, the scissors technique was believed to be the most effective method for jumping the high jump. It was very successful until Dick Fosby came up in the 60s and he revolutionised the high jump. He created the Fosby flop. Now, he didn't realise what he was creating at the time, but it was all about centre of mass. Now, when you jump over the bar with the scissors technique, your centre of mass is level with your hips. You've got to get your centre of mass above the bar. The beauty of the Fosby flop, the centre of mass does not need to be above the bar, meaning you don't have to create as much force to jump higher. The centre of mass is actually underneath the bar. And instead of jumping higher with more force, to become more successful with the Fosby flop technique, it's about flexibility and being able to arc more. So you can jump the same height, but with an increased arc in your back, you will jump higher, as this picture demonstrates. And that's the beauty of the Fosby flop and why it's become much more effective than the scissors technique, because you can manipulate your centre of mass and you can jump higher with less force required.
The next 2 points are looking at levers, what the classification of the 3 levers are, and the different levers within the human body.
Okay, so levers. Nowhere near as difficult as it seems. Okay, you've got 3 types of lever. And there's a nice easy way to remember what goes in the middle of each of these levers. If you remember 1, 2, 3, F, L, E, you can't go wrong. And what that means is first class lever in the middle is the fulcrum. Load and effort on either side, doesn't matter what side. Second class lever has the load in the middle. Sometimes you'll see resistance. Either side is the effort and the fulcrum, doesn't matter which side. And the third class lever will have the effort in the middle and the load and resistance on one side, fulcrum on the other. Again, doesn't matter which side. And there are 3 types of levers. So what we need to look at for the first class lever is the tricep-elbow relationship. The fulcrum is the elbow. We have the radius and the ulnar in the forearm, we have the humerus in the upper arm, and the tricep is the muscle that's involved. It's important that we know the bones and the muscles involved in the first class lever. The fulcrum is the elbow, the load is towards the hand, and this can be increased by holding a dumbbell or an object. And the effort comes from the tricep contracting. That is the first class lever. Second class lever, slightly different. Second class lever is lower down in our ankle. The fulcrum is our ankle. We also have our tarsal bones, we have our tibia and our fibula involved, and we have the gastrocnemius muscle and the soleus muscle underneath. The load is the body weight. All of your weight coming down is the load. The effort comes from your gastrocnemius muscle to contract, to plantar flex around that fulcrum of the ankle. Now, a second class lever is very, very strong, because if you consider the fact that you're lifting your body weight, let's say 70 kilograms, and you're lifting that, let's say you do your 10,000 steps a day, 10,000 lifts of 70 kilograms. Imagine doing that with your tricep, with 70 kilograms in your hand. It can't be done. So the reason there's a difference in classification of levers is the design of the bones and how they work to enable us to achieve certain outcomes. And the most common type of lever in the body is the third class lever. Now, the third class lever, the example we need to know is the bicep-elbow relationship. But there are many examples of the third class lever in the body. This is the most obvious one that we have. And it can even be extended when we have a golf club, a tennis racket in our hand. That lever is even longer for a third class lever. But let's just take what we need at face value Our fulcrum, once again, is our elbow. The effort, yes, it's the bicep that contracts, but the effort for the third class lever, it refers to the tendons that are across the elbow in the forearm, which is why the effort is where it is. And the load, again, is the hand. And this can be your hand, it can be an object, it can be a weight that can obviously change to make it harder for you to contract and to move this third class lever. But there are 3 levers and the differences within the human body.
Next, we need to look at Newton's 3 laws of motion, what they are and their application within sports.
Newton's 3 laws of motion. First law is referred to as the law of inertia. Second law is referred to as the law of acceleration, and the third law is referred to as the law of reaction. You hopefully will have some base knowledge of this from GCSE physics. Let's explore a little bit further. First law is called the law of inertia. What this means is that any object will remain at rest or in constant motion unless acted upon by an external force. I'm going to use golf as an example to explain this shortly. Newton's second law refers to the law of acceleration, and this is that the force is equal to the mass of the object times the acceleration to achieve your goal. I'm going to use basketball as an example here. It doesn't mean that mass times acceleration results in a force. It means that the force must be equal to the mass and acceleration required. And Newton's third law is the law of reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So I'm going to use sprinting as an example here. We've also got walking up and down the stairs. Consider this, you might never have thought about this when you walk upstairs before, but in order to walk upstairs, you actually walk downstairs because you push down into the step to get the force to push up. And that is an example of Newton's third law, the law of reaction. Like I said, I'm going to use sprinting for our analogy here. So, the first law, law of inertia, golf. The ball will remain at rest until hit by the club. And as you can see, it's been walloped off the tee. It's gone. But remember, we're not only referring to the ball at rest, we're referring to a constant motion. Now, that doesn't mean that in golf you hit moving balls or you hit them in the air, but there's other forces that can act upon this golf ball whilst it is in the air. So let's explore what some of these are. We have a gent here, he's ready to drive right down the fairway. What could possibly act upon this ball that would stop it from going into orbit, which is where it would go if it was to maintain its constant motion? Well, it could hit the trees and it could just bounce back down. But if it doesn't, it goes straight down the fairway. The wind, air resistance and gravity will all be acting upon this ball, pulling it back down to the ground. When the ball's on the ground, note that within a golf course there's different levels of grass, and it'll stop the ball moving along the ground, and it'll provide more friction, therefore it will stop the ball on the different levels of grass. And as you can see on many different golf holes, there's many obstacles faced for the golfer. The sand, the water, the wind, whatever it may be, there's many challenges a golfer will face that will impact the motion of the ball as we consider law of inertia. The second law, law of acceleration. Like I said, I'm going to use basketball for this analogy. This lad stood just inside the 3-point line. He shoots a jumper and it goes in. So if we never see the physics of a sporting example, but if he was to shoot this, and let's say it's like a computer game that comes up with numbers, there's a force that's required for him to score this. There's a force output that's required for this ball to go in. Yes, there's projectile motion as well, but there's also a force that's required. And that force is your body calculates this through trial. That's why you practice. And your body understands the numbers without explaining the numbers to you. It understands the mass of the basketball. That's why a couple of times when you've practiced with that ball, you can do it. And it understands the acceleration that's required to score from that particular distance. Now, if this man was to stand 3 yards further back, the mass of the object is the same, the mass of the ball is the same, but the acceleration will need to be slightly increased for that ball to travel the same distance. Yes, he'll have to impact his projectile motion too, but the mass and the acceleration is what needs to be considered. And when you figure out the mass and the acceleration that's required, that is the force that's required to achieve that goal. Rugby conversions is a similar one. If you're 25 meters out, when you take the conversion, take yourself 20 meters back to 45 meters, there's going to be a stronger acceleration needed through that rugby ball, which is the same mass. Therefore, there'll be a stronger force required to kick a ball over a further distance. Even if it's the same distance with a strong headwind, you would have to use more force because more acceleration will be needed to fight through that force of the wind, the air resistance impacting the ball. And this relationship, this philosophy, this is the second law of motion, law of acceleration. There is also an extension to the second law of motion, and that's called the impulse-momentum relationship. So let's look at some of these equations on the screen. Law of acceleration, as we know, is that force is equal to mass times acceleration. We've also looked at impulse, force times time, and we've looked at momentum, which is mass times velocity. So the impulse-momentum relationship is stating that the impulse is equal to the mass and the changing velocity. So it's a similar concept to force equals mass times acceleration. And let's just look at this bottom equation. Take that t that's next to the impulse and put it on the other side of the equation, so it would be a divide. What you have there is force equals mass times acceleration, because that's the equation for acceleration. Changing velocity over time. When you multiply that t to the other side, you've got impulse times mass times change in velocity. And that is the relationship here. And again, the example I've given a number of times is a follow-through. If you follow through in a sporting action, the impulse is stronger. Therefore, you'll be creating more of a change to that velocity of the object, therefore increasing the momentum of the object. So the impulse and the momentum have a strong relationship together to achieve the outcome desired. Law of reaction, sprinting is an obvious example, and the starting blocks is a great example. Look at this picture from the 2012 Olympics. Usain Bolt about to win the 200 meters. If you take all of your knowledge of sprinting away and you just look at this picture at face value, you can just see 5 guys who are about to fall flat on the face. And that's the beauty of the sprint block and why it's such an unnatural skill that needs to be learnt with sprinting. Some of you may have been fortunate enough to use sprint blocks at school, or you may have used each other to create sprint blocks in lesson. But what's happening here is as that gun starts the race, the sprinters aren't running forwards. They push downwards and backwards into the sprint block, and the sprint block returns that force in an upward and a forward motion and propels the sprinter forward. Now note this, it's not a natural position these guys are in. They are exploding out of the blocks at speed. That's why they're not toppling over, because the velocity and the change of velocity is preventing them from falling over. But the fact is that they're pushing downwards and backwards into them blocks and getting propelled forwards, enabling them to get a good start to the race. And we also have an extension to the law of reaction, and that's called the conservation of momentum. Now, the conservation of momentum pretty much dictates that the momentum before a collision is the same as the momentum after the collision. So take the pool balls, for example, on screen now. As the white ball hits the pool balls, the momentum is conserved and it is exchanged into the other pool balls as they go off in their opposite directions. And this philosophy comes from Newton cradle. We've all seen the Newton cradle before. Momentum is conserved as the balls interact with each other. No momentum is lost. So sporting examples, as I've said already, the white ball striking the rack or striking any ball, the momentum is conserved and it is also exchanged onto the object that it's in contact with. Another example is in tennis. Now be careful here, because just hitting a tennis shot, the momentum isn't conserved all the time, because it depends on what type of shot you play. If you have an inelastic collision, then the momentum can be absorbed and lost. But the way it's conserved in tennis is when you take on the old-fashioned approach of a serve and volley. If you run to the net with a closed wrist and you volley at the net, you simply return the ball with the power that's hit at you. And that is that the momentum is conserved, no momentum is lost, and it is regenerated in an equal and opposite direction hopefully into the corner, winning you the point in tennis. And it's an example of the conservation of momentum within sport. An American football tackle is considered to conserve momentum, but it's an inelastic collision. So a lot of it is lost through the depression of the body as it absorbs the pressure and it absorbs the momentum. So it isn't conserved as obviously as these examples I'm giving you. So tennis and pool are two easier examples, a tennis volley and a snooker break.
Next, we need to explore the relationship between angular momentum, moment of inertia, and angular velocity. And we need to explain the concept of angular momentum in sporting activities.
Angular momentum is the product of moment of inertia and angular velocity. Now consider momentum. We've looked at that a few times now. Mass times velocity. It's the same thing, but on an angular level. So a moment of inertia is the tendency to resist angular acceleration, and we'll explore that later. Angular velocity is the speed traveling around an axis with direction. So it might be clockwise, anti-clockwise, because it's velocity, therefore it has vector quantity, has direction and magnitude. And that's what makes up angular momentum. Moment of inertia and angular velocity, very similar to momentum in a linear basis. Now, angular velocity is your rotational speed around that axis point. And the last point I want to talk about before we move on is torque. Torque is the rotational force. It's the push that enables you to rotate around the axis, and that is the torque that you produce and generate. So let's explore these concepts a little bit further. We've probably seen this before, rotating around a spinning chair. If you pull your arms and your legs in tight, you speed up. If you take your arms out and your legs out, you slow down. So what happens to your angular momentum? You would argue it slows down, doesn't it, right? Because that's what happens. You slow down, therefore your angular momentum slows down. But that's not true. This is another example of the conservation of momentum. Angular momentum is conserved. What changes is the angular velocity and the moment of inertia. When you pull your arms in tight to your axis point, so your arms and your legs are closer to your rotation point, your axis point, the angular velocity speeds up. And when you put your arms out, your moment of inertia increases because it's more difficult to rotate around. So it's a force, you're reducing the torque because it's harder for you to rotate, therefore you're reducing the angular velocity. But if you were to pull your arms straight back in, you would automatically speed up. You've not created any more force, you've just reduced the moment of inertia, therefore increasing the angular velocity. And if you were to keep pulling your arms out and in, it would keep changing the speed of your rotation. So the understanding of angular momentum not being lost is quite clear there. It's clearly conserved. So without an extra push from anybody, you're able to speed up and slow down. Now in the world of sport, this is very apparent in gymnastics and in diving. And as you can see from our two examples on screen here, the gymnast on the right-hand side has tucked her arms in, close to her rotation point, and this will enable her to speed up slightly, her upper body in particular. She's rotating around the axis point. Look how vertical she is. So therefore she will be able to rotate around that vertical axis really easily. If she wanted to do a somersault, then her legs would need to tuck in a tuck position in order for her to speed up. As you can see on the left-hand side, this diver is rotating around his axis point, and it looks like it's a slower rotation. It looks like he's coming out of the rotation, ready to enter the water. And throughout these movements, angular momentum is conserved. And what they tend to do is they tend to straighten up before they either land with the ground or they dive into the water. And by straightening, they decrease the angular velocity, meaning they've got more control over their movement, and they increase the moment of inertia. Now, what's really interesting, we've already spoken about the conservation of angular momentum. What's really interesting, when a diver enters the water, it appears that they're entering the water very straight and they're not rotating anymore. But this is wrong. Remember, angular momentum is conserved. All they've done is they've slowed down their angular velocity by increasing their moment of inertia. They've reduced the torque, their rotational speed. So when a diver actually enters the water, this is what it looks like. They continue to rotate. Now, if they've done it right in the Olympics, you see hardly any splash, and they've not actually entered the water straight. They've mastered their ability to slow down their rotation so they can enter the water in what appears to be a straight move. And as they go underwater, they continue to rotate, and they end up with their face up, feet down, creating lots of splash under the water. And that is another example of the conservation of angular momentum that can be visibly seen as the diver goes underwater and they continue to rotate. Have a look on YouTube, you'll be able to see it yourself. That's the conservation of angular momentum. Then obviously as they hit the water and they rotate underwater, the momentum is lost. But this is the only time it's lost from the second they dive from 10 meters up. All the way down, it's conserved all the way until they're underwater.
Now we're going to explore projectile motion in a range of sports.
Projectile motion, I'm going to keep it simple. We're going to jump into the field events within athletics. We're going to start with the jumps. When you look at projectile motion, there's three things to consider: angle of release, speed of release, and height of release. Now, the height of release is the same for the high jump and the long jump because it's from the floor. That's where your feet are, that's where you're jumping from, it's from the floor. So there is no height of release to consider here. The speed of release, both require speed, that's why there's a run-up for both of these events. But the long jump does require more speed of release, hence the longer run-up. And hence the reason why some sprinters are actually quite able long jumpers, because they build up that speed in the approach. It's the angle of release that's very, very different. The long jump between 15 to 27 degrees, obviously dependent on your size, your speed, your technique, etc. But it's roughly within that range. Whereas high jump, much, much higher because you're trying to go over a bar that is vertical above your head. Goes without saying, it's quite an obvious example. The second example I'm going to look at does examine all three elements to projectile motion. Height of release. For each of these objects, the discus is a little bit lower because you're rotating around your shoulder being horizontal. The shot put's obviously on your shoulder and you're pushing upwards, and the javelin, you're able to lean back a little bit more and start a little bit lower and release that up as high as you possibly can. So the height of release, there is some discussion point there between the three events. Angle of release, the three throws, is somewhere in between 32 and 38 degrees. Again, dependent on your technique, dependent on your height. If you're 3 inches taller than somebody else, then you may be able to come out at 1 degree lower than them, and that might be an advantage to you. So these are conversations that a coach will have with their athlete when trying to calculate the optimum angle of release. The speed of release, well, this is what separates them all greatly. The javelin has a run-up, so it's a linear speed that's produced to create the throw. The discus doesn't create a linear speed, but it creates a massive rotational speed. So there's a huge torque required in order to generate the distance of the discus, which is, a world record over 70 meters. The shot put, heavy object, a little shuffle, again only goes 20 meters or 23 meters for the world record. So each three events are different, but you must consider for each of them the height of release, the angle of release, and the speed of release. Going back into the sports world, basketball is an interesting consideration here for projectile motion. The more loop and more arc you create, the rainbow effect on the shot, increases your chances of scoring a basket within basketball. Steph Curry, arguably the best three-point shooter ever, has a slightly higher arc percentage, generates more height, has a steeper angle of release than many other basketball players. This can be argued that he's slightly smaller at 6'3" than most of the other athletes in the NBA. And he's, like I've said, he's known as the best three-point shooter ever. And one reason is because of his different angle of approach to the shot increases his chances by a small percentage over his opponents. So there's many interesting things to consider with projectile motion, but they all boil down to the same thing. Height of release, angle of release, speed of release.
And finally, we're going to talk about the Bernoulli principle in relation to projectile motion in sporting activities.
So before we look at the Bernoulli principle, I want you to look at this example. I want you to try this yourself. Pick up 2 pieces of A4 paper, hold them a couple of inches apart and blow between the pieces of paper. Note what happens. They come together. The reason they come together is as you blow down the middle of the paper, you are increasing the velocity of airflow. You are speeding up that air. And that creates a low pressure because it's moving faster, it's easier to move. So there's a low pressure, high velocity. On either side of the paper, there isn't an increase in velocity. So we can consider that to be a low velocity and a high pressure on the outside, but it's harder to move when the velocity is lower. The high pressure wants to move to the low pressure and it forces the paper in towards each other. Now we're going to explore this in a range of ways, but the outcome is always the same. The high pressure moves towards the low pressure, just like gas exchange when you learnt that in the CV system. So the Bernoulli principle refers to an inverse relationship between airflow velocity and air pressure. It sounds complicated. Once again, it really isn't. If there is a high velocity, meaning the air around an object is high in speed, so it's got a high velocity around an object, the pressure is low. If the velocity around an object is low, the pressure is high. Now, when you learn gas exchange, you'll have learned that gas moves from a high pressure to a low pressure. That philosophy is exactly the same here. The air pressure wants to move from the high pressure to the low pressure, just the same as gas exchange. So let's look in the world of sport with this philosophy. An F1 car, the way it's designed is as the car accelerates, it creates a downward force. This is massive in F1. It means cars can speed round corners and instead of slightly lift off the ground, they're actually pushed towards the ground, increasing the friction, increasing the impulse between the tyres and the track, reducing their chances of skidding off the track. So there's a downward force that's produced the faster they go. It means that the pressure above the wings of the F1 car is higher because the velocity of the air underneath the wings is higher. So therefore the high pressure moves towards the low pressure, which is towards the ground, keeping the F1 car down. Don't worry if you don't understand it yet. We've got many more of the same example. A plane. So you're not going to use this in your exam, but this is just for your understanding. A plane works the same as the F1 car, but in reverse. So the air pressure underneath the wing is higher because the velocity is lower than above the wing. And it makes sense. Just look at the plane. Look at all of the obstacles that are taking place below the wing. Nothing above it. So therefore the velocity of the air above the wing will be faster because it can move faster above the wing. Therefore the pressure underneath the wing is higher because there's a lower velocity underneath the wing, and that forces that high pressure to the low pressure, which is above the wing, giving it up force, lift force, and the plane can stay in the air. Well, let's look at some examples that will help us. And usually we're going to talk about rotating objects. So it's something that's called the Magnus force. It's the same thing as the Bernoulli principle, but it just means rotating around an axis. So let's look at tennis. If you're to hit top spin in tennis, you hit the top part of the ball. Okay, and what that does is gives an increased velocity underneath the ball. So as the ball rotates around, there's an increased velocity underneath the ball. Remember, because there's an increased velocity under the ball, that means that there is a low pressure. Meaning on top of the ball where you've hit, there is a low velocity, a high pressure, and because the high pressure is above the ball, it wants to go to the low pressure, which is underneath the ball, and that forces the object down, a downward force, topspin. Looking into a different sport, golf. Now, golf, you hit underneath the ball. You don't hit a topspin shot in golf, but you're not supposed to anyway. If you hit the underside of the golf ball, you create velocity increase on top of the ball. Low pressure on top of the ball. That means under the ball is low velocity, and that's right, you guessed it, high pressure underneath the ball. The high pressure wants to move to the low pressure, so that creates a lift force and the ball moves upwards. Particularly with a higher iron, 7, 8, 9 iron, where you're trying to generate backspin, if you like. We also have football. Let's consider a free kick. Using the inside of your foot, a right-footed player, you kick the right-hand side of the ball. This increases the velocity on the left-hand side of the ball. Lower pressure. There's a lower velocity on the right-hand side of the ball. Higher pressure. That high pressure on the right-hand side of the ball wants to move towards the left-hand side of the ball. And as it keeps searching for this equilibrium, as it keeps searching for this happiness, it rotates around the object, forcing the ball to move left. And that's how you get a curved free kick, or a curved pass, or a cross. You can do this on the other side of the ball and it will go the other way. And that is the Bernoulli principle, mainly the Magnus effect of the rotational force of the Bernoulli principle, but it's a simple relationship between high pressure wanting to move to low pressure, and there's a simple relationship between low velocity resulting in high pressure, high velocity resulting in low pressure. Hence the reason of the inverse relationship. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for teaching resources, check out the TES website and go to the Physical Educator shop. You can pick up the whole unit, movement analysis, looking at all aspects, including a prison break challenge for the sliding filament theory, joint movement analysis, and a full comprehensive biomechanics section 2. We also consider IA suggestions as well as practical lab ideas. Check out the resource in there. Good luck. See you again soon.